Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching. My name is Stephanie D. Chang. I'm a PhD candidate in economics at Harvard University, and this presentation is on my job market paper, Careers versus Children, How Childcare Affects the Academic Tenure-Track Gender Gap. As many fields and job sectors seek to diversify and reach gender parity, we might think of the biological sciences as a success story. Compared to most science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM fields, in which women are a distinct minority, women compose the majority of biological science degree recipients. Their growth has even surpassed overall female growth at the collegiate level, as shown in this graph that relates the percent female among bio BA recipients to percent female among all BA recipients. This growth in percent female is sustained through the PhD level, which also now is majority female recipients. Biology was one of the first PhD fields for women to break into, and even as more women enter PhD programs, biology's female PhD growth continues to outpace all PhDs as a whole. But even with biology's successes at reaching gender parity, its academic pipeline still persistently leaks at each career stage. Despite large gains in gender parity at the BA, PhD, and recently postdoctoral level, growth in percent female at the tenure track level has trailed behind. Note that this isn't the case for all permanent positions, as the percent female in non-tenure track positions and industry positions has been growing more quickly than among tenure track positions. Coinciding with the large leak from postdocs to tenure track, approximately 40% of bio PhDs have children within the first 5 years post-PhD graduation. This close timing between when they have children and when they start permanent positions suggests that bio PhDs put off having children until they complete their doctoral and postdoctoral training. But they may be hitting against a fertility constraint as they move on to the tenure track. As women traditionally take on most household tasks, they may be especially vulnerable to career childcare trade-offs, which has become even more salient in recent times. On the left is a tweet that recently went viral, showing Dr. Gretchen Goldman, a research director at the Union of Concerned Scientists, being interviewed by CNN while surrounded by the mess of her 2-year-old and 4-year-old children's toys. The pandemic and closing of childcare centers has certainly shone a light on the challenges facing working mothers, but this juggling of career and children has far predated 2020. As is the case in other job sectors, female scientists spend more hours per week on domestic tasks, including childcare, than their male counterparts. Because of how much time must be dedicated to raising young children, particularly during a pandemic with few options to export this work, childcare pulls especially mothers' time away from their work. Thus, having pre-kindergarten children has been associated with lower tenure track chances for female but not male scientists. The overarching question of this paper is, despite the large gains in gender parity at the pre-PhD and PhD level, why are there still large leaks in the biological science academic pipeline? In particular, how does the precise timing of the birth of one's children differentially affect the parental career trajectories by gender? And then, by comparing different job types held by biology PhDs, can we identify what specific characteristic of the academic labor market is contributing to this gender gap? Here's a roadmap for the presentation. First, I'll discuss my dataset and its advantages in constructing as complete of a picture of biology PhD careers as possible. Then I'll go into the 2 steps of my methodology. The first uses a novel identification strategy to triangulate the birth years for a PhD's children from repeated observations of grouped family data. The second methodology describes how I systematically construct 10-year post-PhD career paths from my detailed longitudinal dataset. I'll then discuss my results. I start with a raw comparison of the timing of one's first child's birth and how it compares to the parental career trajectory. I then examine how job characteristics differ across job types to identify the specific mechanism driving this child effect. Lastly, I'll discuss the growing implications of this work and conclude. As a preview of my results, I find that childcare shifts scientist mothers away from the hours-intensive tenure track. Although there are no differences in tenure track rates among men and women prior to having children, after having their first child, mothers temporarily reduce work hours and a fraction of them leave the labor force temporarily. This short-term reduction in work leads to long-term reductions in promotions and salary, particularly in an hours-intensive occupation like the academic tenure track. Although mothers return to the labor force once their children reach school age, they move away from tenure track positions and into jobs with fewer hours at the expense of a permanent pay cut. Compared to the tenure track, other job types, including those in the academic sector through non-tenure track positions, do not see this loss in female persistence. Thus, I conclude that the combination of time-intensive childcare and long hours required for promotion pushes mothers away from the tenure track towards more family-friendly occupations. This paper contributes to 3 strands of the literature. The first is general persistence in STEM academic research and the STEM pipeline. As build up to this paper, I have constructed over 156,000 STEM PhD career paths across 6 job types and 2 employment statuses, painting a very detailed picture of the types of jobs held by STEM PhDs. The second strand of literature examines how children impact the career trajectories of women, especially in highly educated fields. Much of the previous literature has used indicators for children in the household or children of a certain age. But in this paper, I demonstrate how the precise child's birth year can be estimated from group age data about the household's total children that is observed multiple times. The third discusses how female workers select into occupations with more flexible hours, often at the expense of a wage cut. I illustrate how even PhDs, who are very attached to the labor force, experience the sagging middle in labor force participation during their 30s that Golden and Mitchell 2017 observed in the female workforce as a whole. I then link this temporary time out of the labor force and this switching to more flexible hours occupations directly to the timing of one's first child's birth. So going into the data, for this project, I use NSF's survey of earned doctorates, the SED, linked to the 1993 to 2015 waves of the NSF survey of doctorate recipients, or SDR. The SED is a census of all US research doctorate earners administered in the year of graduation. So if you have or are currently pursuing a PhD in the US, you should expect to be in this data set. This survey collects basic demographics, education through the doctorate, and immediate post-graduation job plans. From the SED, a nationally representative sample is chosen to be followed roughly biannually in the SDR for the course of their careers. If you are selected for the SDR, you will be emailed and phoned somewhat constantly until you fill out the survey, which I have heard can be quite annoying, but it does lead to a relatively high response rate for each survey wave of about 70%. Each wave gives extensive information on demographic changes, in particular the number of children in the household in select age bins, your additional education past the doctorate, and current job characteristics. A couple questions also refer to previous positions, so some information can be pieced together on previous jobs. Joining the SED and the SDR together, I can essentially follow the largest nationally representative sample of STEM PhD recipients from US institutions over the course of their careers. To give you an idea of the information provided by the SED-SDR data, here are just some individual demographics collected on the surveyed bio PhDs, split by gender and whether they are ever observed having children. Later in the presentation, some big gender gaps will appear. However, at least across race, citizenship, and education through the doctorate, these groups seem relatively balanced. This indicates that the variation I exploit is not confounded by demographic differences. This table gives just a few of the job characteristics collected by the SDR surveys. Right away, notice that the salary gender gap widens with the presence of children. Similarly, although women never observed with children tend to have more job benefits compared to men without children, there are large gender gaps in benefits among individuals who are ever observed having children. We also see that mothers work fewer hours on average and are more likely to be working less than full time compared to fathers and those without children. Interestingly, there isn't much of a shift in the gender gap for work activities. Across the four groups, the percent of jobs where applied research is the most frequent work activity is steady at about 20%. Individuals with children do tend to do less basic research than individuals never observed with children, but that drop is greater for males, so actually the gender gap in basic research gets smaller with the presence of children. Going next into the methodology. From the data, I am given a PhD's total number of children in the household in select age bands. To estimate the child effect, I exploit the repeated observations of this group family data to precisely estimate each child's birth years. Because children could leave the household, say to go to college, I first track changes in the number of children in each survey wave to identify new births and children leaving the household. Once I have identified a PhD's total number of children, I can then split the grouped age bins across survey waves into each individual child's age indicators. One key assumption that I make is that children enter and exit the household in chronological order. Thus, the leftmost child indicator is attributed to the youngest child, and the rightmost child indicator is attributed to the oldest child. If this assumption is violated, for example, if the second oldest child goes to college before the oldest, I would misattribute an age indicator to the wrong child and potentially drag down the estimated birth years of that older child. However, without further information from the survey, I would not be able to correct this assumption. I can then narrow down the possible birth years for each child using these age indicators across survey waves, as the child's actual birth year must fall within the age indicators in each survey year. In addition to using the estimated birth year, my analysis also groups PhDs by the timing of their first child into those who never have children, those who have their first child before their PhD graduation, those who have their first child in the first 5 years post-PhD graduation, and those who have their first child 6 to 10 years post-PhD graduation. There is a small percent of the sample that have their first child more than 10 years post-PhD graduation, but given that that's a relatively small percent of the sample, I consider them outliers in the data and do not include them in the main analyses. Here are some summary statistics on the estimated timing of first child's birth. The left table can be seen as a check of the methodology, with the number of years identified as possible first child's birth years. So for 59% of the sample, I can narrow down the first child's birth to a single year or 2 years. There is a small error rate of 4.7%, which occurs when the end of the estimated birth year range is an earlier date than the start of the range. As I alluded to before, this comes from the assumption that children leave the household in chronological order. Without further survey data, I cannot correct this error, but luckily this seems to be a small percent of the sample. And as a robustness check, I have removed these observations from the analysis, and it does not significantly impact the results. You may also notice that there are seemingly random increases at 4, 6, and 7 years. These correspond to the size of the age bins given in the survey. If an individual only fills out one survey wave while they have children, I would not be able to reduce their child's birth years down from the survey information. For analysis, I take the median year of the range as the estimated birth year. This reduces measurement error, as on average, I would expect the children's ages to be evenly distributed across the age bins. As a robustness check, I have repeated the analysis using the earliest birth year, and this does not significantly impact results. So this right table then gives some parental summary statistics with relation to that estimated first child's birth year. Indicative of children being more time intensive for women, male PhDs are more likely than female PhDs to ever have children. And a larger percent of male PhDs have children before their PhD graduation compared to female PhDs. For both men and women, the average parent age is really hitting close to that 35 years old. Again, the age at which a mother is considered an advanced age. I then want to connect the timing of a PhD's first child's birth to their careers. So for each post-PhD year, I identify whether an individual spent any portion of the year in each job type and employment status of interest. This is an expansion of Ginther and Kahn 2017's measurement of postdoctoral incidence. And essentially what we are doing is creating job type indicators for every year from their PhD graduation to the present. In this work, I track the 4 most prevalent job types among bio PhDs: postdoc, academic tenure track, academic non-tenure track, and for-profit industry, as well as one employment status out of the labor force. I also pull job characteristics such as hours worked, work activities, and salary from survey years. For individuals who have changed jobs since their last survey response or are no longer working, I also pull their reasons for doing so. For my analysis, I focus on bio PhDs who graduate in the 1990s. This provides the largest sample of cohorts with at least 10 years post-PhD job data, allowing me to better analyze their long-term career paths. Here are some summary statistics from the career paths data, again grouped by gender and whether an individual is ever observed having children. Note that the tenure track gender gap more than doubles between those who never have children and those who have children, and the out of labor force gender gap nearly triples. Yet the gender gap among other permanent positions, such as non-tenure track and industry, are unchanged by the presence of children. The time spent in most job types, conditional on any experience in the job type, doesn't drastically differ by the presence of children. However, there is some increase in time out of the labor force for mothers compared to fathers and their childless peers. Getting now into the results. Among individuals who do have children, I examined the fraction of individuals who are in tenure track positions in the 10 years before to the 10 years after their first child is born. As you can see in this graph, in the 9 years before their first child is born, there is no significant gap between would-be mothers and would-be fathers in tenure track positions. About a year before the first child is born, a very slight gap starts to emerge. This gender gap becomes significant right after the child is born and continues to widen for the first 10 years of the first child's life. As a comparison, this graph examines the fraction of male and female PhDs who are never observed having children in tenure track positions in the first 10 years post-PhD. Note that among these individuals who never have children, there is no consistent gender gap. The gender gap in academic tenure track positions coincides with mothers' temporary reduction in work. Consistent with other highly educated, high-pressure occupations like law and business, a significant fraction of bio PhD mothers temporarily leave the labor force after having children. Prior to having children, there are almost no male or female PhDs out of the labor force. A growing number of women start to leave about 2 years before their first child is born, peaking at 9% of women with 4-year-old children out of the labor force. Note that the percent then starts to go down around the time the first child is 6 years old. In other words, once the child reaches school age and thus needs less round-the-clock home care. This sagging middle, a term coined by Golden and Mitchell 2017 in labor force participation, happens regardless of when in a woman's career path she chooses to have children. Individuals who never have children have the lowest percent of women out of the labor force, and this stays relatively constant over the first 10 years post-PhD. Those who have children pre-PhD see that hump already appear in those first couple of years post-PhD, peaking at around 2 to 3 years out. Those who have children in the first 5 years post-PhD see that hump appear a little later, starting at 1 year post-PhD and peaking around 5 years out. And finally, those who have children 6 to 10 years post-PhD have that hump appear last, starting at around 6 years post-PhD. Note that for disclosure purposes, small cells have been suppressed from the graph. So particularly for men, the lack of data points in these graphs is indicative that almost no men in those groups are out of the labor force. Interestingly, this gender gap does not appear in other job types held by bio-PhDs, such as industry. This graph gives the fraction of individuals in for-profit industry positions within the first 10 years before to 10 years after their first child is born. Note that there is not only no gender gap in the rates over time, there's also no break or widening around the time of the first child's birth like we observed on the academic tenure track. This indicates that there is something particular about the academic tenure track position that's contributing to this gender gap. Even more particular, this characteristic is not observed in other academic positions. So in this graph, there is no significant difference in the fraction of men and women who are in postdoctoral positions in the 10 years prior to 10 years after their first child's birth. If anything, female biologists are more likely to be in postdoctoral positions than male biologists prior to the birth of their first child, indicative that the changing work situations of scientist mothers is not due to a lack of interest in academic careers. In non-tenure track academic positions, we actually see a reversal of the gender gap observed on the tenure track. Again, there is no significant difference in non-tenure track rates among men and women prior to having children. But around the time their first child is 4 years old, a larger fraction of mothers compared to fathers are observed in non-tenure track positions, and this gap increases over time. Recall that the first child being 4 years old is also the peak of when mothers leave the labor force. So as they start to make their return to the labor force, this graph indicates that they may be returning to non-tenure track positions over tenure track positions. This difference in gender gaps within the same job sector of academia indicates that there's a particular characteristic of the tenure track that is driving mothers out. Contrary to popular belief, the research activities of non-tenure track positions are actually fairly similar to that of the tenure track. Asking individuals in these positions what work activity they spend the most time on, 38.5% of non-tenure track employees and 36.2% of tenure track employees spend the most time on basic research. Approximately 4 percentage points more non-tenure track employees spend the most time on applied research than tenure track employees. So overall, it actually looks like non-tenure track employees are doing more research or more focused on research than the tenure track employees, who seem to be splitting their time between research and teaching. Because more non-tenure track positions are performing research activities than tenure track positions, we cannot explain the tenure track gender gap as just a difference in research focus. There is also no evidence that non-tenure track positions are in less research-intensive environments than tenure track positions. This graph gives the fraction of academics at Carnegie classified high research activity or R1 institutions in the 10 years prior to 10 years after the birth of their first child. So although women become more highly concentrated in non-tenure track positions after having children, there is no significant difference in their likelihood to be at a R1 institution than fathers who are more likely to be in tenure track positions. Rather, the big difference between these positions seems to be the average weekly hours worked. Tenure track and postdoctoral positions have higher average work hours than industry and non-tenure track. The postdoctoral positions might be an outlier, as their temporary nature may have a smaller effect on bio-PhDs' career childcare trade-off, particularly as many of these PhDs are putting off having children until they complete their training. However, comparing the permanent positions, non-tenure track and industry positions are closer to a standard 40-hour work week than tenure track positions, as they work approximately 4 and 6 hours less per week. This shorter hours work week may be more in line with the schedules of working mothers. In this graph, prior to having children, there is no significant difference in hours worked between men and women. But after having their first child, working mothers reduce their hours by approximately 12% of pre-child hours, compared to working fathers who reduce their working hours by half that amount. The work hours of mothers are similar to that of the non-tenure track and industry positions, further illustrating how women are selecting into these more flexible occupations after having children. Looking at the self-reported reasons for changing work situations, family stands out as a major reason that women change. For these questions, individuals can mark as many of the reasons given that factored into their decision to not work or to change jobs. And after having children, mothers are far more likely to say that family matters factored into their reasons to change their work situation than do fathers. Although it's a noisier measure, the fraction of mothers listing these reasons matches up with what we see in the quantitative data using the job indicators. We see this hump shape in attributing family-related reasons to not working that matches up with the hump shape of the percent out of the labor force. When family becomes less of a reason to stop working, mothers are also returning to the labor force, indicating that other reasons for leaving work are not as pressing as having children or these family matters. It is possible that it's more socially acceptable for women to claim family-related reasons for their changing work situations. However, if that were the case, I would expect a consistently high fraction choosing this reason among women across their child's life, rather than this kind of increase that corresponds to the actual job changes. Furthermore, seeing as individuals can mark as many reasons as apply, I would expect a higher fraction of women to select other reasons if they did factor into their decision. But comparatively, the mothers seem to choose family reasons at a much higher rate compared to the other reasons. So altogether, this suggests that mothers, constrained by the time needed to care for their children, are purposefully selecting into positions with lower hours that allow them to better balance their career and their children. How does this then affect mothers' salaries over time? Because job types vary widely in their average salary, a raw comparison of salary over the first 10 years prior to 10 years after their first child's birth masks the gender gap due to mother selection into different job types. So to examine this effect, I must account for the job that the mother is in. I run a full regression predicting salary by gender, an indicator for having children, a quadratic for years prior to having children, a quadratic for years after having children, female interactions, and indicators for the job type. So essentially, I am trying to repeat that raw comparison analysis, but now incorporating more worker characteristics and also incorporating the job type indicators. Once I have added in all of these controls, a permanent salary gap appears due to the timing of the first child's birth. As shown in this regression, having children significantly decreases women's salary compared to fathers and their childless peers. The salary gap does not close even as mothers return to the labor force and their children get older. As I alluded to earlier, this problem is even more salient in a COVID-19 reality. A recent survey of principal investigators found that female PIs with at least one child under age 5 experienced on average a 40% decline in research time, compared to about 21% for all respondents. All else equal, having at least one child under the age of 5 corresponded with a 17% decline in research time. In comparison to the 12% for reduced working hours I find in my research, a back-of-the-envelope calculation would suggest that the COVID-19 pandemic could increase the gender gap in academic tenure track rates to between 15 to 35 percentage points. Going beyond academia, in the overall workforce, female employment has been down 9% since February 2020, with 4 times as many women dropping out of the labor force as men. Recall that 9% dropping out of the labor force is fairly similar to what I observe amongst academics leaving due to the birth of their first child. Much of this loss in female employment has been attributed to the closing of childcare centers and schools, as working mothers without a support system are now much more pressed to choose between their children and their careers. And in order for us to recover the economy, we really need solutions that allow mothers to make that balance, particularly during a pandemic. I want to end now on a high note by saying, what can we do? This problem is big, but by identifying the mechanism behind it, we can work towards policy solutions that stopper this leaky pipeline. Note that previous research indicates it's not as easy as just pausing the tenure clock or extending parental leave, particularly if you're going to use gender-neutral policies. With these types of policies, women may still feel pressured to keep working when they are recovering from childbirth or trying to raise their children in order to stay in competition with their male peers. These policies are also typically less than 6 months and may be too short to account for the time needed to raise children. So instead, I propose solutions that lessen the burden of childcare on working mothers, such as expanding childcare availability on university campuses. Alternatively, we can reduce the work hour burden on mothers and mold Tenure-Track to better align with other research jobs that have been able to keep their female workforce through more flexible hours. Our current labor force overemphasizes the 40-hour work week and overtime, such that an individual who works part-time makes much less per hour than an individual who works full-time. Allowing for equalized pay per hour, regardless of total hours worked, could better even the playing field for mothers who are productive but might not be able to work full-time. And as a silver lining, the pandemic may have actually introduced more options for working mothers. When academic labs were forced to shut down due to COVID-19, they had to get creative with what work could be done from home. If this environment persists even post-pandemic, once childcare centers and schools are reopened, it may actually allow for traditionally office-only or lab-only jobs to permit working from home, an arrangement that may be better in line with mother schedules. So in conclusion, this paper examines the bio-PhD labor force using the largest longitudinal survey of US STEM PhDs. I precisely estimate the birth years of over 10,000 biological science PhDs children, and then connect it to the parental career paths across 4 job types and 1 employment status. In doing so, I link the timing of a PhD's first child's birth to changes in their career trajectory by parental gender. I find that despite large gains in gender parity at the bachelor's and PhD level, the simultaneity of time-intensive childcare and demanding work hours deters women from persisting in high-pressure occupations like the academic tenure track. As is the case in other job sectors, female scientists have a sagging middle in labor force participation as they temporarily leave to care for their children. However, in a competitive up or out field, this short-term reduction in work can lead to long-term reductions in promotion and salary. Thus, in spite of the great strides that have been made in the biological sciences to improve gender parity, as women leave high-intensity positions on the tenure track for more family-friendly work hours in industry and non-tenure track, a significant gender gap within academia persists today. Thank you all so much again for listening to this presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time. The full paper is available on my website at scholar.harvard.edu/sdcheng/research. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is stephaniecheng@g.harvard.edu. Thank you so much again.